Welcome to Dev Bootcamp Live, the podcast where we help you level up so you land your first engineering job and you become the best engineer of your team. My name is Juan Lizarazo,
And I'm Jared Potter.
and today, Jared, you are the one to pick the topic. So, what are we going to discuss today?
Today, we're going to be talking about front-end JavaScript libraries and frameworks. I know a lot of my students that I teach in my coding bootcamp, along with Juan's, are a little bit confused sometimes about what are these front-end frameworks? What kind of value do they provide? And perhaps when, they're not necessarily the most appropriate thing to use. And lastly, perhaps what are some differences between them? So Juan, can you maybe give us a little bit of just a high level intro of what are these libraries and frameworks? And then
Yeah,
perhaps
yeah.
add on to it to say what's kind of the difference between a framework and a library, just at a high level.
Yeah, no, that's a very good topic. Like because every time we pick a topic, right, we're always thinking like how we can help our students or any bootcamp graduate to land their first engineering job, right? We want to deliver on that promise. And knowing about the frameworks, just thinking about that as you were mentioning, when like these bootcamp graduates, right, like our students, they learn React, right? So we have to do React. But professionally, for example, I don't work with React professionally. You don't work with React professionally. So I think this is a very good topic because it will help us tell them like, look, when you land your first engineering job, chances are that maybe you won't be working with React. So it's good to know about other tools, and employers usually will hire you if you know React, even if they don't use React, because there's some similarities and best practices and things that are shared across libraries. So I think this topic is really good to show that value. And really the message here for anybody listening is that you got to be aware of these things. You don't have to be an expert of everything. Like just continue becoming an expert on React, master React, but if that's what you know, but no, be aware that there's other libraries, frameworks, and things that you will have to deal with as you land your first engineering job. So yeah, Jared, answering your question about the libraries and frameworks, React, of course, right? That's the very popular today, right? And it's been for the past few years. We have also Angular. That one is it's like an alternative, of course, is different, is more opinionated. We have also Vue, which is very popular, and it has like a little bit of things from both worlds, right, from React and Angular. Like they borrow things from each other, and each of them have a lot of cons and pros and cons, right? They have trade-offs and good things. And those are like the three big ones. There's other ones that I haven't really worked with, I mean, lately, but there's a lot of component libraries and frameworks out there that you can always research. For example, a few years ago, a few years back, there was one called Polymer when web components started and they were not a standard yet, right? So it's always changing. But I think the three I have in mind right now is just React, Angular, and Vue, and they're all open sourced. Facebook created React, right, and he's the main backer for that library. And React is considered a library. About Angular, Angular is a considered a framework. Is more complete, more opinionated, right? There's less freedom, right? So that's one of the trade-offs. There's maybe more overhead, but it has its benefits. And that one is backed by Google, right? And then we have Vue. Vue, I don't know if it is specifically backed by one single company, but it has a lot of sponsors. But it's fully open source, and it's also like very popular and very very powerful. So yeah, that's kind of like a good overview to start this conversation, Jared, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a note about Vue there. Yeah, there isn't any formal company that backs Vue.js. However, there is a core team of developers that is supported by the community that is continuously building on Vue.js. Right. Just a couple months ago, they had released their version 3 of Vue to the public. So a lot of exciting changes coming from them. But yeah, let's dig in a little bit deeper here. So uh, to provide people a little bit of context about like what are some of the high level things that provide value from these libraries and frameworks, are a few things, right? So pretty much the number one thing, and I'd like to dig into each of these a little bit more, but just initially, number one is the ability to build reusable components, UI components, right? And we'll get into that. There's also two-way input binding, right? Which is a really powerful thing that's automating a really basic thing that you likely already know how to do in vanilla JavaScript. There's also the ability to do HTML templating and JavaScript variable interpolation. So think about that as being able to take variables in your code and inject them into your HTML. It also allows you to have a router which allows your application to be a single page application. Which essentially, I mean, if you've ever been on a website before and click between the navigation and it like essentially appears like instantaneously, right? You're on a single page application if you've ever experienced that.
Yeah, and we have a whole episode on that. Like, just go check through the playlist, and we have a whole episode of SPA. So check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, ultimately, all of these things kind of come together to allow us to build better web applications more efficiently, right? So let's kind of back up a little bit and kind of dig in a little bit more in there. So Juan, give us a little bit of an intro. What are reusable components? What are components anyway in the web?
As you mentioned, those three things, right? The binding, interpolation, and component creation. And like, just thinking about this, like you were mentioning those things and you were not being specific about like, oh, this is just React or Angular or Vue, right? So that's common ground. These frameworks and libraries, they solve those problems. And really, like, it goes down to what we call abstractions. They're abstracting the hard work, doing the heavy lifting for us when we create these different things using these patterns, right? So for example, for components, answering your question, components, right? This is just something that is, it's a way to abstract and create user interfaces. I always see them as the building blocks for user interfaces. So every time you have something in your UI, in your user interface, many times you see that some items are repetitive, right? So those are good candidates to become an abstraction, and that abstraction can represent that interface, that item, that component, right? That unit that the user will interact with. So when we talk about reusable components, we have a component and this unit, this building block, and it can be, you just code it once, really. You defined that inside whatever framework you're using, it doesn't matter. You just define it once, you encapsulate certain behaviors, it receives certain inputs, it has certain outputs, it has certain look and feel, right? Maybe some options to be configured, and then you can just drop it anywhere in the application. And that's why when it comes to reusability, it's just like an abstraction, right? That you can reuse multiple times and you don't have to be rebuilding it over and over. One of the very powerful things is that, for example, let's say you are creating an application and you need a dialogue, like a model or a dialogue, and then you can just create a component. You just create it once, you put the behavior, the styling, everything you need, and then let's say you have different dialogues throughout your application to tell your user different things as the user interacts with your software. Then you can just reuse that, but it's just as easy as dropping some markup, right? Some HTML tag somewhere, and it will just render and it will just work. So it's good. About components are about abstractions, and they're the building blocks for our user interfaces.
Yeah, that's an excellent response right there. And I think that it's also a great example that you highlighted there of, when you have something that needs to be reused across your web application in different ways, where the inputs might be different, right? The actual text you're displaying, but everything else is the same. Yeah, just create the component, just create it once, and then you can reuse it across your entire web app, right? Or even potentially other web apps.
Your video just froze. I think we have to restart your video. And you just turn it off and on. Okay, perfect. Okay, it was frozen completely. Okay, keep on. Okay.
Should I just pick up? When did it freeze?
Yeah, it was just the video. So I think that is fine.
Okay. Yeah. So again, I mean, the ability to be able to create these reusable components is just really, really helpful in building modern day web applications. So yeah, I think that's a great point there. And again, like Juan said, all of these things that we're talking about today, Vue, Angular, and React, all have this idea of building components and reusing them. So next on the line is going to be the two-way input binding. So to kind of give an intro to this, so whenever you have a web app, and on that web app, you have input fields, right, in a form where you need to take in some sort of information. We want to be able to bind those inputs to variables in your JavaScript. And the two-way binding part of this is that when you change the input box, it's going to update the variable in the JavaScript. And likewise, if we change the variable in the JavaScript, it's going to reflect that change in the HTML, in the markup. So Juan, can you explain why this is just so useful? And otherwise, it's a little bit more difficult in vanilla JavaScript.
Yeah. So the two-way binding is very powerful because when you create a form, you have. If you use just plain HTML, there's no science to it. You just create a form, you put inputs to it, you fill them out, and then you are able to just post that data to whatever action you define in your markup, and there's not really need for any binding or JavaScript at all. But in reality, when we have modern web applications, we are allowing to edit existing entities. Like, for example, if you have a user profile, this user profile is going to pre-fill the information with data. If we answering your question, if we use plain JavaScript or vanilla JavaScript, it's more complicated because we have to find those document object model elements, the DOM elements, the nodes, and then we have to set the value from the data we get maybe from some sort of backend or API. But the thing is that to do that, there's a lot of boilerplate code because we have to do like document.getElementById, by ID, then we have to set the attribute and set the value. So it will initialize the property. So there's a lot of overhead there. And that's one of the abstractions these frameworks provide by doing two-way data binding. So the nice thing is that we can initialize and pre-fill these forms with data that we get dynamically. But the other nice thing is that as soon as you start modifying that data, let's say you change the name in your user profile, and then you're going to click save in that form. Then when you click save, then you already have a model that is already updated and you don't have to do any extra step. And this is really native and true to Vue, React, Angular. You can bind your forms and your inputs to objects, and these are just plain objects, plain JavaScript object literals that you don't really have to do anything. All this overhead is taken care of for you, and that's one of the big benefits of two-way data binding.
Yeah, that's a great job explaining that one. Thank you. To kind of keep building with that two-way binding, we open up to kind of a slightly bigger topic, which is kind of HTML templating and interpolation, right? So one thing with a lot of these frameworks and libraries, like Juan said, with the two-way binding, is really great for forms, either for filling them out initially or editing them in the future. But there's also times where we just want to inject values in there, right? So when we talk about that user form, let's say there's a value that doesn't actually change, right? When they initially created the account, let's say there was like a username, right? Well, when you're like rendering out the user's profile, that name, that username, you can just use, interpolation in the template to be able to do that. And usually this is going to be, you'll see this as like your HTML tags, and then you're going to see like these curly braces. And some of these frameworks will use double sets, so two of them. Some of them just use one set. But it just makes it really easy to just inject text into your HTML. Otherwise, you have to do the same thing like Juan was saying, where you have to use your document.query selector or get by ID and then set the value, and it just ends up being a lot more code, a little bit messier.
Yeah, it's a lot of
But
overhead. Yeah,
yeah, absolutely.
and the other thing that you're mentioning there that is super nice, like that you were mentioning, that you don't really have to use just a form, right? Like that username, you can just put it in a plain div, and there's no form, but it's still bound to dynamic data you're getting from an API. So that's really one of the big use cases and big benefits. And in this case, it's just one way data binding because we're not allowing editing to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Another really important thing that we see in HTML templating with these frameworks and libraries is also the ability to conditionally include a CSS class attribute or not, right? Which is really helpful to be able to manage the style of your site, the user interface and the user experience that the user is experiencing. So those are all the different types of things that you can do with these frameworks and libraries, is to be able to connect in your JavaScript into your HTML and have a very rich user experience. Do you have anything to add to that, Juan?
Yeah, one of the common cases for that is that, for example, if you have your form and it is a form, you can put some sort of style when the input is invalid, right? Let's say maybe you want a date, but you enter a letter, then you can have some sort of red alert around it, or a notice. So that dynamic binding also helps you apply the styles, and that's one of the examples. Other examples, when you have, for example, maybe my user profile page, I want it to be blue, and you selected blue, right? You dynamically apply that style, or you apply a class, and that will just work based on some state that you get, and you hydrate from your API and into your state that is bound to your markup. So those are like common use cases that you run into, and doing that with just plain vanilla JavaScript is there's a lot of boilerplate and overhead, and you can get into more complicated cases and have a lot of repetitive code and stuff. So that's one of the big heavy lifting that these frameworks and libraries do for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's just a lot more JavaScript that you have to write by hand to either append the class or remove
Mhm.
the class, or also managing whether or not the class has already been appended or not. Like there's just, yeah, a lot,
Oh yeah.
like you're saying, just a lot of code that has to go into it.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm gonna take a break here to share our Twitter accounts. So I'm just gonna share here. So you can follow us on Twitter. Oops. Okay. You can follow us on Twitter here. So I'm at Juan Lizarazo G. That's my handle. You can find links on whatever platform you're listening this on. You can find links on either on Anchor or in whatever podcast platform or in YouTube. So follow us, tweet at us, engage with us. We answer questions there. We publish new content there too. And yeah, so make sure to follow us.
Yep. And everybody can find me at twitter.com/Jared Potter. That's JaredPotter. Feel free to tweet at me, ask me a question, tell me what you're working on. I'd love to hear from you.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so let's continue.
Yeah. So the things that we had just covered right there, right? Reusable components, two-way input binding, and kind of the HTML templating and binding of attributes and things like that. Those are the really core things that all of these things share and comes right out of the box. The next kind of topic that we're going to be talking about is the router, or what makes it a single page application. Now, depending on what you're using, for example, if you're using Angular, Angular has a router built into it out of the box, whereas Vue and React intentionally don't have the router built in because there might be use cases where you don't need multiple pages to, well, virtual pages, if you will, right? In a sense, you just need one page to show your main app. So sometimes you don't need all of the code that goes into building a robust router. So, Juan, give us a little bit of what a router is and what value it provides in these frameworks when we do add them.
Yeah, no, that one, that's a huge one. And like the routing thing. So routing really, like when you have a library or framework and you use a router to mount and unmount components, really that all it does, the routing, it just manages two things really, like high level. One thing is the URL where you're on, like the portion, the path portion after your domain, right? So what it does is that it manages browser history. For example, when you click back and forth in your browser using the browser buttons. But really, what the router is doing is that is mapping a route to a specific component in your application. So let's say you create a React component, you can map slash sign up route into a sign up component that will render that page. And then if you have different mappings, it's usually is declarative. So it's really nice with routings because you have a declarative API where you can define your route, the component that you will mount there. And what the routing is doing really, like just high level, is just appending or removing elements from the document object model, depending on the route that you have. And then if you navigate back, is listening to those changes and also changing the browser history. So then when you go back and forth, it will mount and unmount based on that. So it's just really that's what a router does. It's really just mounts component, removes component or destroys components, and then maps to a specific route. But Jared, you just said virtual routes, and really that just means that these routes, like everything is just mounting from maybe your main index.html, but it's just masked through JavaScript to these different routes. But everything is just the same file, and that's why they are single page applications. And we talked about it in the other episode that we did a few weeks back.
Yeah, definitely reference back to that previous episode to get a little bit more in-depth, view of what that is. We won't go too much into that here, but it's a great episode to listen to.
Yeah, one of the things that with routing that you also have that I mentioned is that, and it depends on what you use for routing, but it's lazy loading. So sometimes you can just lazy load specific application chunks or JavaScript files or assets based on the route, and that will also speed up the size of the application. If you have a very large application as a single page application, it will be really hard to have it used as a single file because it's going to be very heavy. The payloads are going to take longer over the network. So also these routers usually provide a strategy to lazy load different chunks based on a specific route.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a great explanation there. One kind of thing I wanted to talk about a little bit here, and Juan had mentioned it a little bit here, is that what is kind of the difference of framework and library? And, you're going to find a lot of people out there that are going to use those very interchangeably. And then there's going to be people who will defend the separation of them. You know, I don't care, a lot about it specifically, but I think it is important to know generally what the distinction is. So, uh, a library is going to be something that's going to be a little bit, generally speaking, lighter weight and less opinionated about what you want. So, in this case of the three big, frameworks and libraries that we're talking about, the only one that's actually a library or claims to be a library is React. So React, claims to be a UI component library for building web applications, but they don't provide a ton of opinion about how you should structure your application, or they also don't necessarily include all of the things that you might want in your application, like a router, because again, it's giving you the option on whether or not you want to add one in. Now, there is an official React router, or of course, you could install any other one that you want. Where on the other side, where, with a framework, they are going to be a little bit more opinionated about how you structure things. Excuse me. They're going to have, certain documentation that's going to recommend that you build things a certain way. And there's value to that consistency and that structure, right? Like if you have worked in a job building Angular, generally speaking, if you go to another job doing Angular, a lot of it's going to be similar because of that opinionated nature. And a framework will usually also come with some more built-in tooling. But Juan, what's kind of your take on the difference and some of the other distinctions?
Yeah, so with when you have a library, there's more chance to do to make mistakes if you're not experienced, right? With a framework, because you have these guidelines and these best practices and ways of doing things, it's just easier to not make mistakes, but the learning curve is more steep. So that's one of the trade-offs. If you go with the framework, you will spend more time learning how to build things within the framework. If you go with the library, you're going to get things built, you're going to build things faster, but there's a better chance that you will make more mistakes if you're not experienced. So that depends usually on the team. Like if you have a very experienced team on React, then everything is going to be great, right? But that's one of the things. Like the opinions are good, especially when you have a lot of new people, because it's easy to point them to the official documentation, officially style guides. This is how you do things. Oh, you should use this library, this specific version. Another thing, versioning. The frameworks usually they come with a set of packages. So, for example, Angular specific, and I'm sure Vue, you are like, okay, I have this version of Angular, so you should use this version of the Angular router and this version of the Angular HTTP module, and this, so you match the versions. But when you're using React, you can have version mismatches because there's some libraries that are not official. So maybe you want to upgrade React, but then your dependency that you're using is not yet ready for that new version of React. So then you have to wait because it's maintained by a different team because it's open source. So that's kind of like part of the trade-offs on when choosing one or the other. But my recommendation would be like, if you're going to go with React with something that is going to be maybe enterprise or large scale, make sure to pair up with somebody very experienced. So then you will have a better and easier time and you'll build the right thing since it is more open and you can like take more paths and more ways to do the same thing. If you're going to do Angular, for example, make sure that you go and do the homework and go through that steep learning curve, because you have to spend more time learning the specific things for the framework. There's a lot of more DSL, these specific domain languages that for example, Angular has a lot of non-standard HTML attributes you gotta learn if you want to build a lot of Angular stuff, right? So that's the learning curve. So that's kind of like the trade-off. Which one is better? It depends on what you're building. If you're building a very tiny small application, right? Maybe React is going to be easier. You're going to do it faster, and it's going to be easy to find things. But maybe Angular is too much overhead. But it depends really on what team you're on, the preference. Sometimes you can build the same thing with, I mean, you can really build the same thing with Angular, Vue, or React. So it goes down more to what the team likes. So that's kind of like the trade-off. But it's good to have that distinction between library and framework.
Yeah, absolutely. One little distinction I want to offer our listeners out there is when you are doing research and practicing with Angular, it's important to remember that way back in the beginning, version 1 of Angular is now referred to as Angular JS, and all other versions from 2 plus were a complete rewrite. So when you are looking at resources, make sure that whatever you're looking at is going to be specific to what you want, which is probably most likely going to be Angular 2 plus, which I think
Mm-hmm.
went through version 10 now, I believe. So just
11,
make
I
sure
think.
that
Yeah.
whatever you're looking at, that you are looking at the correct version, because there was a very big break in compatibility with that.
And it's usually hard to find things because sometimes the team wants to just call it Angular, right? But when you're searching for things, usually you have to search for how to do this on Angular 8, 9, 2, right? That's how you're going to find the answers, because if you just search for Angular, you many times you run into, for example, Stack Overflow answers about Angular JS. So it makes it really hard. Maybe it wasn't the best decision to go with the same name when they were going to build a whole new framework, but it's something that happened and we cannot do anything about it. But it's definitely confusing at times when you're looking at documentation for both libraries or frameworks. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. So I think we're out of time, Jared. Yeah, anything else that you want to add before we wrap it up, or if not, we can just jump on to our recap.
No, I guess the last thing I would just encourage students to do is, I mean, as with all of the episodes, we have some bit of homework. If you've perhaps have a little bit of experience in React, maybe set aside yourself some time, an hour or two to just explore Angular or Vue, just to kind of see how things are done a little bit differently, just to kind of play around. And whether or not you ultimately build something in it or not, I think it's a very educational experience.
And for landing jobs, that's really useful because let's say you've been doing just React, but you go to a job that does Vue, and they usually say, oh, if you know React or Angular is fine, we'll teach you Vue. So if you go there and you're like, oh, I have played with Vue, I have built basic stuff, I understand how this works, then it's very valuable. So it's really good. Like, I don't have professional experience with Vue. I have played with it at the very basic level, but that's good because I can like maybe get an opportunity at some point if I were to make a switch to work in Vue. So it's good to have that exposure because then you see the value that it offers. And Vue has a lot of nice things that Angular doesn't, right? So you wish like, oh, I wonder how you do this in Angular. So it also opens your mind to search for new things or ways of doing things that maybe you were not aware that the library or framework you use supports, because usually there's an alternative. Oh yeah, this is how you do it in React. So it's really good to have that exposure and broad knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just to kind of recap things here, we talked about the different JavaScript front-end frameworks and libraries out there. We talked about the primary top three, Angular, Vue, and React, as we've said throughout the episode. We talked about how all of these share some core attributes, one of them being the ability to create reusable components in your UI. They also offer the way to do two-way input binding to make the use of forms much more efficient in your web applications. And we also talked about how that can even go further with HTML templating, where we can inject variables into our HTML that can be dynamically updated. We can also dynamically update class attributes for styling purposes. And we also talked about how we can also add a router into our web applications to manage multiple pages in a virtual sense and provide a very snappy, responsive user experience.
Yeah, and that's pretty much it. You summarized it really good, and we kept it agnostic. We were not specific to like a specific APIs and stuff. It's just common things that all these frameworks and libraries solve in a very great way. So it's good to be aware of that as you're applying for jobs. So perfect. Thank you so much for joining us today in this episode of Dev Bootcamp Live, where we help you level up to land your first engineering job and become the best engineer on your team. I'm Juan Lizarazo.
And I'm Jared Potter.
Thank you so much, and I will see you next week.
See you guys.